Hi, my name is Byron Weber-Becker. I teach computer science at the University of Waterloo as my day job. One of my hobbies is advocating for reforming the electoral system used in Canada. An electoral system is simply the rules that we use to elect our leaders. It's how we conduct elections. I'm much more concerned with how we elect our parliaments, bodies with many decision makers, than I am with electing single decision makers, like a mayor. My niche in the movement to change our electoral system is looking at the system as an algorithm. An algorithm has inputs and outputs. In this case, the inputs are how people voted, and the output is the name of the winner. There are many possible algorithms to convert votes into winners. I want to analyze them. Not in the traditional computer science sense of big O runtime or memory usage, but in terms of how well they meet certain social goals. A social analysis of algorithms. There is a long and rich tradition of analyzing rules that elect a single winner, like a mayor. Kenneth Arrow, for example, made a very reasonable list of criteria and then showed that there is no system that always satisfies all of those criteria when there are more than two candidates. Others have followed in Arrow's footsteps. But those are math proofs for single winner systems. I'm interested in electing parliaments, not mayors. As a result, my techniques have focused more on simulation and looking at the results of real-world elections. The first part of this talk is focused on work I presented in 2016 to a committee of Canada's Parliament that was looking at electoral reform. In their final report, my testimony was cited or referenced at least 10 times and figured prominently in their first recommendation. The presentation also uses materials I developed for Fair Vote Canada, an organization promoting the reform of our electoral system. The second part of this talk is focused on work that I did with Tony Hodgson to support a court case challenging the constitutionality of our current electoral system. Essentially, that our current system does not meet some of the guarantees that our Constitution makes to its citizens. This video is being recorded in August of 2023. The first stages of this court case are expected to be heard in court in September of this year. So, what's the agenda for this talk? Well, we've just talked about electoral systems as algorithms, as an introduction. I want to next address what are appropriate social goals for these electoral system algorithms. I want to take a brief look at which algorithms are other countries already using and how do these algorithms actually work. This will be the bulk of the talk, intermixed with how these systems deliver on the principles that we will discuss. The last part of the talk will be focused on the Charter Challenge work. These are the principles that the Parliamentary Committee were told were important. This is a wall of text, so let's break it down and add a new one that I think is important but overlooked by the committee. The Parliamentary Committee's principles clustered into 5 areas, outlined on the left. The first one is the effectiveness and legitimacy. Basically, do the algorithms fairly translate votes into representatives? This is the core issue in my mind. Our current algorithm is not fair. We need to replace it with one that is. Engagement is asking questions like, do people feel like their vote matters? That it actually influences the election? If so, they are more likely to vote. Some electoral algorithms reward candidates that trash their competitors. Other algorithms reward behaviors that seek common ground. I'd rather have the latter. Similarly, some algorithms tend to show Canada's western provinces as mostly conservative and our eastern provinces as mostly liberal. Other algorithms show that we're actually much more alike than that. Some algorithms encourage parties to only run safe candidates, usually white males. Other algorithms encourage a greater diversity of candidates in gender, ethnic background, or other traits. The accessibility and inclusiveness group simply says that simple is good, but not at the expense of the other principles. Integrity, all of the algorithms that we'll look at meet this criteria. Local representation, Canada has a long tradition of valuing representatives from the local community. Voters should see their representatives in their local community and should be able to vote them out of office if dissatisfied with their work. Finally, the criteria that the committee should have listed but didn't. Good governance. We'd like to have stable governments, so we don't have elections every year, but would also like to have governments that enact long-lasting policies that are supported by a majority of the voters. We'll examine our current electoral system, known as first past the post, and then ask you to consider how well it meets these criteria. We'll then look at some of their alternatives and again ask you to consider how well they meet these criteria. But first, let's take a quick look at a classification of these algorithms and then briefly at which countries are currently using which algorithms. The first thing to know is that there are many different electoral systems. Most systems belong to one of two main families, winner-take-all and proportional systems. In the winner-take-all family, the most prominent system is known as first past the post. That is what Canada uses now. Another winner-take-all system that has received attention recently is known as alternative vote. In the proportional family of electoral systems, one group is multi-member systems, and the other is mixed-member systems. A more recent addition, rural-urban proportional, has elements of both. Again, there are many variations on these systems. We'll then look at one representative from each group. But first, let's take a brief look at which countries are using these systems. For this comparison, we're really interested in countries like Canada, similar in values, lifestyle, and of course, democracies. We're using democracies that ranked very high on the United Nations Human Development Index as our benchmark. Let's look at countries using a winner-take-all system. On the UN's Human Development Index, there are 4 countries that use first past the post. Canada, of course, the United States, Singapore, and the United Kingdom. The only country on the list to use the alternative vote is Australia, and even there, it only uses it for the lower house. Several countries use two-round or parallel systems that we won't discuss. On the other hand, here are all the countries in the United Nations list that use some form of proportional representation. Some of the prominent ones are New Zealand, Germany, and many other European countries. As you can see, Canada and the United States are really in the minority here of sticking with first past the post. The bulk of the world uses proportional systems. So now let's take a closer look at first past the post. Canada uses first past the post now. In this system, the country is divided into geographical regions called ridings. Canada currently has 338 ridings. Each riding is represented by a single person, the candidate who receives more votes than any other. Note that it does not need to be 50% plus 1. It just needs to be at least 1 vote more than any other candidate in the riding. When we have a federal election, we are really holding 338 independent elections, 1 in each riding. This might make sense from the individual riding perspective, but when we aggregate all of those results, all of those independent elections together to form a parliament as a whole, the algorithm can be unstable. By that I mean that it is sensitive to its inputs, and a small change to the inputs can result in a large change to the outputs. Let's look at a couple of scenarios. Instead of looking at an election with millions of voters over 338 ridings, let's consider just 5 ridings, each with 20 voters. That's a total of 100 voters. Assume that 40% of the voters vote Liberal, a centrist party in Canada. Assume that 35% vote Conservative, a right-of-centre party, and 25% vote NDP, a left-of-centre party. With 5 ridings, there will, of course, be 5 MPs. We'd hope that about 40% of those MPs, or 2 of them, would be Liberal, about 40% would be Conservative, and about 20% to be NDP. That is, with this voter distribution, we'd expect 2 Liberal MPs, 2 Conservative MPs, and 1 NDP MP. So here's one possible distribution of the 100 voters into those 5 ridings. In ridings 1 and 2, here and here, There are more Liberal voters than anything else, and so those ridings will have Liberal MPs. Similarly, ridings 3 and 4 have more Conservative votes than anything else, and so they will have Conservative MPs. And that last riding will have an NDP MP. Note that in this case, variations in voter distribution gave the right results. But that doesn't always happen. Consider flipping this one voter from Conservative to Liberal. And to maintain the distribution that we have over here, we'll also flip or convert this one Liberal voter to a Conservative. That gives us this distribution. Notice that we gained an extra Liberal MP. So now the Liberals have 60% of the MPs, but only 40% of the vote. In fact, it's not hard to come up with a scenario in which the Liberals gain 100% of the MPs with only 40% of the votes. A uniform distribution of voters among the ridings will do that. In each riding, voters vote in the same proportion as the country as a whole, with the result that the Liberals have 100% of the MPs. Now, one might say, it's okay that the Liberals receive more votes than anyone else. It's okay to give them all of the power to implement their platform. But it's not quite that simple, because the first-past-the-post algorithm can also give the party with the most votes no MPs. Here, the Conservatives have their strength concentrated in the West, and the NDP have their strength concentrated in the East, while the Liberals' strength is distributed uniformly throughout the entire country. In this case, the Liberals, with the most votes overall, receive no MPs at all. So you might think, yeah, but those are theoretical results. What happens in real life? Well, here's an example from the 2015 federal election. The Liberals received only 40% of the votes, but the first-past-the-post algorithm gave them 54% of the seats. Having a majority in Parliament, 50% plus one of the MPs, is a coveted situation for a party. It means that they can pass whatever legislation they want without needing to consult with anyone else. When they have a majority of the MPs, but don't have a majority of the votes, it's called a false majority. A false majority is not particularly rare in Canadian politics. Here are the results of the 2011 federal election. They are almost identical, except that the parties have switched places. In the 2019 federal election, the Conservatives won the most votes, 6.24 million, to the Liberals, 6.02 million. But the first-past-the-post algorithm gave the Liberals many more seats, 157 to the Conservatives, 121. This is called a wrong winner election, and is simply a less extreme version of the third situation we looked at earlier with the 100 voters. The 2021 election was also a wrong winner election when considering the national vote. We could hope that false majorities and wrong winners would be rare, but they are not. Since 1930, 60% of our elections have had these anomalous results, either wrong winner or false majority. In the 1987 New Brunswick provincial election, the Liberal Party won a legitimate majority with 60% of the votes. But the first-past-the-post algorithm gave them every single seat in the legislature. Not a single opposition MLA was elected. Stop and think for a moment on the effect that has on democracy. Who holds the government to account? Who represents the 40% of voters who did not want a Liberal government? How can an opposition party gain experience in governing if they are completely shut out? What we've seen in the last 5 slides is that first-past-the-post often exaggerates the winning party, giving them more than their fair share of the seats in Parliament. But there are other issues. First-past-the-post can make us appear much more divided than we really are, undermining our social cohesion. Toronto is not nearly as liberal as the election results would make it appear. Here they got 100% of the seats in 2015, but only had 52% of the votes. Similarly, the Maritimes appears to be very liberal, 100% of the MPs with only 59% of the votes. Alberta appears to be very conservative, but in reality, 40% of the voters voted for someone else. In addition to making us appear more divided than we actually are, such lopsided regional results make it hard for a government to form a regionally balanced cabinet. We've been looking at how the first-past-the-post over or under represents people according to their party, but there are other ways of grouping people. One could ask, for example, does Parliament approximately match the diversity of Canadians in gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, or any other measure one might readily propose? One of our most basic identities is gender. This slide compares the percentage of women elected to national legislatures in 11 different countries. We see that those countries using some form of proportional representation do much better than those that use a winner-take-all system, such as first-past-the-post. These results with gender are also reflected in other diversity measures, such as ethnicity. First-past-the-post fails to fairly reflect our diversity. Another criteria we had for Parliament dealt with local representation. One of the strengths of first-past-the-post is that MPs are local. But one of the weaknesses is that each riding has only one MP, which may not see the issues the same way that you do. In fact, after the 2015 federal election, only 49% of Canadian voters were represented by an MP from the party they voted for. More than half of the voters could legitimately feel that their viewpoints were not represented in Parliament by their local MP. In proportional systems, most voters have a representative from the same party that they voted for. But what about long-lasting policies supported by most Canadians? Another one of our social goals or criteria. Okay. Canada has a problem with policy lurch. A government with a false majority forces through a policy that lacks widespread support, only to have that same policy undone by a future government of a different stripe. Such policy lurch makes it difficult for businesses, public institutions, and even families to plan for the future. Research has also shown that countries with proportional representation have more collaboration among parties that results in longer-lasting policies. For a Canadian example, consider the minority government of Lester B. Pearson. Cross-party cooperation resulted in the healthcare system that we now know, our flag, and the Canada Pension Plan. All of these have become pillars of Canadian life. One of the traditional measures for an electoral algorithm is the proportionality of votes to the MPs. That is, an algorithm's outputs should be proportional to the inputs. If 40% of the voters voted for a Liberal candidate, then about 40% of the MPs selected by the algorithm should be Liberal. This graph shows that proportionality under various simulated conditions. The center of the graph, right here, shows the results of an actual election, in this case 2015. The light red line is the percentage of Liberal MPs. The dark red light line is the percentage of Liberal voters. This gap represents a disproportionality between the votes and the result. The blue lines represent Conservative MPs and Conservative votes. They are much more aligned, those are closer together, they represent a much more proportional result. Okay. The New Democratic Party, NDP, received fewer MPs than they did votes. These simulations for the first-past-the-post algorithm start with a real-world election at the center. Okay. As these lines move away from the center, it represents simulations in which the Liberals gained votes at the NDP's expense. In those situations, the gap between the red lines widens, represent an even greater disproportionality. As you move left on the graph, it simulates elections in which the NDP gained votes at the Liberal Party's expense. These simulations for first-past-the-post algorithms start with a real-world election results. I've then run them based on many different elections as starting points. The results always look basically the same. first past the post does not do a good job of allocating votes to parties in a proportional way. Let's take a look at another kind of winner-take-all system, the alternative vote. It's also called ranked choice voting and instant runoff voting. A goal of alternative vote is to find a single candidate that is most acceptable to the group of voters by taking into account second, third, and maybe even fourth or fifth choices. Alternative vote uses a ranked ballot, which is different from what we in Canada are used to. Many other electoral systems also use a ranked ballot. A ranked ballot simply means that voters can say who their second, third, fourth, even fifth choices are, in addition, of course, to their first choice. These choices are taken into account when the ballots are counted. The general idea of alternative vote is to count the ballots using the top-ranked remaining candidate on each ballot. If a candidate gets 50% plus 1, he or she wins. Otherwise, drop the least popular candidate, redistribute those ballots, and count again. Let's look at an example. In this example, a pile of ballots for each candidate has been made, each with ballots listing that candidate as the first choice. 38% of the ballots are for the conservative candidate. That's more than any other candidate, and so under first past the post, the conservative candidate would win in this election. However, under alternative vote, they need 50% plus 1. The independent candidate has the smallest pile. That candidate is eliminated, and their pile of ballots is redistributed. Each ballot is placed on the pile for the highest ranked candidate that has not been eliminated. Suppose that half of those voters' second choice was for the Green candidate and half for the Conservative candidate. That gives this situation, and the algorithm repeats. No one has 50% plus 1 yet, so the Green candidate is eliminated because that pile is the smallest. Again, those ballots will be redistributed with each ballot going to the top-ranked candidate that hasn't been eliminated. In this example, most of the Green votes go to the Liberal candidate, with some going to the Conservative candidate. The NDP candidate is now eliminated, and again, the ballots are redistributed. Most go to the Liberal Party candidate. They now have more than 50% and are declared the winner. So, the candidate that started out in third place became the eventual winner, because that person gained the second and third place choices of other voters. They were, in some sense, a more acceptable candidate to a broader cross-section of voters than any of the other candidates. This seems really reasonable. And in fact, I think alternative vote makes a lot of sense when elected a single person, like a mayor. So what's not to like about alternative vote? Well, first of all, it's possible to have a wrong winner, just like it is with first past the post. But beyond that, remember that I'm interested in electing a parliament, not just a single person. When each riding runs an independent election using alternative vote, the aggregation of the results into a parliament is often not what we want. It usually gives the same result as first past the post. When it does not, it always favors larger parties over the smaller ones. It also favors centrist parties. In simulations, it's even more disproportional than first past the post. For example, simulations using 2015 election data overrepresented the Liberals by 24%, rather than just 15%. Because of that, it suffers from all of the same problems as first past the post. It has unfair results, limited diversity. Many voters end up without a like-minded representative. In simulations, even modest vote gains by the winning party translates into much larger gains in the number of seats. At the far right of this graph, simulating a shift of 30% of the NDP's vote, that is, shifting only 6% of the total vote to the Liberal Party would have given them a 46% of the vote, but about 80% of the MPs. That's a staggering disproportionality. In spite of these issues, the core alternative vote algorithm remains interesting to me. I think the problem is not the core algorithm, but the choice of stopping condition. Alternative vote runs the algorithm until there is only one candidate left. But what if we stop earlier than that, before we've eliminated all but one? Before we pursue that question, let's stop and take stock of how these winner-take-all algorithms stack up against the social goals we outlined earlier. I'll let you form your own opinion about this, but here's how I see it. Let's now start to delve into the proportional family of electoral algorithms. We'll start with multi-member approaches. The core idea is to combine several ridings into one larger riding, but elect the same number of MPs. We'll take the ridings surrounding the University of Waterloo as an example. Here are 5 ridings that could be combined into a single, larger riding. In the 2015 election, these 5 ridings elected 4 Liberals and a Conservative. The question is, how would we elect 5 MPs if we could do it as a group rather than each individually, as in first past the post? We commented earlier how unfair first past the post was on the national scale, with Liberals gaining 54% of the seats with less than 40% of the votes. In Waterloo Region, it was much worse. The Liberals gained 80% of the MPs with only 46% of the vote. This came, of course, at the expense of the Conservatives, the NDP, and the Greens. We would be much closer to proportional if we had elected 2 Conservatives, 2 Liberals, and an NDP. It's not perfectly proportional, but it's much closer than what first past the post gives us. The question is, how do we count our votes to arrive at this more or less proportional result? There are many possible algorithms to achieve this. First, with 5 MPs to elect, let's just recognize that the ballot is going to have more candidates on it. Okay. Back to the algorithms. One possible algorithm is for each voter to select their favorite candidate. Now observe that in this example, Conservative candidates earned 36% of all of the votes. With 5 possible MPs for the riding, that equates to roughly 2 or 40% of the MPs. So let's list the Conservative candidates in order of the votes that they earned from highest to lowest, and then take the top 2. In this example, that would be Charles Cooper and Kerry Cohn. Run the same algorithm again for the other parties to elect Lily Laverty and Logan Long for the Liberals and Norman Neighbours for the NDP. The Greens, unfortunately, are not successful in electing someone in this larger riding. Another approach is to build on my earlier comments regarding alternative vote. This is called single transferable vote, or STV. It starts just like alternative vote. Voters rank their candidates in preferred order. Votes are tallied. The voter with the fewest votes is eliminated and their ballots are redistributed to the remaining candidates. The difference is that instead of stopping when there is only one candidate, we stop when the number of remaining candidates is equal to the number of MPs for the expanded riding. In this case, we stop the algorithm when there are 5 remaining candidates. The result is pretty proportional, as the following simulation shows. The core result is based on the 2015 federal election, which is pretty proportional. It stays proportional as we swing the votes going this way and this way, from the NDP to the Liberals or vice versa. It also stays proportional if we shift votes between Conservatives and Liberals. The single transferable vote algorithm has a number of attractive attributes. The results tend to be proportional, that is, it fairly translates votes into winners. The larger the number of MPs in a riding, the more proportional it is. Thanks to the ranked ballot, voters can express their preferences easily. STV enhances diversity among the elected candidates because a candidate needs the support of a much smaller block of voters in order to win. Voters are much more likely to have a like-minded representative within their riding. However, one of the significant disadvantages of multi-member systems is they need to combine ridings. In Canada, the ridings can get geographically huge. Let's shift now to another family of proportional systems, mixed-member systems. Mixed-member proportional systems borrow ideas from our current first-past-the-post approach and from multi-member systems. It does this by having a single-member riding within a multi-member region. To understand what that means, let's again look at Southern Ontario as an example. University of Waterloo, in this example, is right in there. So we know how things went with these 15 ridings in the 2015 federal election. 5 went to Liberal candidates, 10 to Conservative candidates, and none to any of the other parties. This makes local results much more skewed than the nation as a whole. Within this region, Liberals earned 42% of the votes, just a hair more than Conservatives, and yet the Conservatives won 2/3 of the MPs. Mixed member proportional addresses this by continuing to have 15 MPs, but 10 of them would be in single member ridings and 5 of them would be in the region at large. The regional MPs are chosen to ensure overall proportionality with the popular vote. This means that each riding becomes half again as large. Here's how the region might be redistributed from 15 ridings into 10 ridings. We could guess that these 10 ridings would have elected 6 Conservative MPs and 4 Liberal MPs in the last election. Each of those would have been elected using first-past-the-post, our current system. The question is, how do we elect the remaining 5 MPs? If we were to allocate all 15 seats proportionally, would give 6 to the Liberals and 6 to the Conservatives. The NDP would have 2 and the Greens 1. Here's how we think the riding seats would have been allocated, but what about the 5 regional seats? Recall that they are to be chosen to maintain the overall proportionality between MPs and the popular vote. Because the Conservatives received 6 riding seats already, they don't get any of the regional seats. They already have their fair share. The Liberals and the NDP, however, each receive 2 regional seats, while the Greens receive 1. That's the goal. How do we achieve it? There are several approaches. One way is to give everyone 2 votes. The first vote is for the MP to represent your riding. That vote would be just like now. You vote for one person. Whoever receives the most votes in your riding becomes your MP. The second vote is for the party that you prefer. This is the vote that's used to calculate the proportional results, how many MPs each party should have for that region. That takes care of the 10 riding seats in this example. But what about the 5 regional seats? Well, start by making an ordered list of each party's candidates. Then, remove any candidates that have already won a local seat. Finally, take as many candidates as needed from the top of each party's list to make the overall results proportional. That would be none from the Conservatives, 2 from the Liberals, and 2 from the NDP. How should those lists be ordered? One way is to let the parties do it before the election. That's called a closed list. Another way is to order them according to the number of votes each candidate received. That's called an open list. Simulating MMP elections results in pretty proportional results. Mixed member proportional systems are designed to be proportional. That's good. They share some attributes with our current system, which is comforting to some. But they have some disadvantages. They need to reduce the number of ridings to make room for the regional MPs. This makes the ridings larger. Many voters will not have like-minded local MP. Some people don't like having 2 kinds of MPs, thinking that one kind is inferior to the other, or one has more work to do than the other. Finally, MMP doesn't provide much help in diversifying Parliament along gender, cultural background, or any other criteria. This is largely due to the winner-take-all nature of the local riding elections. The last electoral system we'll look at is known as rural-urban proportional. We'll use Alberta as an example. Rural-urban is a made-in-Canada solution. It hasn't been implemented anywhere else in the world, but it is designed to solve some uniquely Canadian issues. Full disclosure, I was part of the design team. It features excellent proportionality, but its big advantage is that it addresses the huge difference in riding sizes in Canada. We have some ridings as small as 10 square kilometers, while our largest is more than 2 million square kilometers. If we formed a multi-member riding for northern Alberta consisting of just these 3 ridings, the result would be more than 360,000 square kilometers, larger than all of Germany. Rural-urban addresses this issue by combining the ideas of multi-member ridings and mixed-member proportional, depending on the population density. The rural-urban system leaves large, sparsely populated ridings as single-member ridings, like first-past-the-post. MPs are elected with a winner-take-all system, as they are now. However, more densely populated areas are gathered into multi-member ridings with between 2 and 7 MPs, depending on the density. To compensate for the disproportionality of the single-member ridings, a small number of regional MPs, like with mixed-member proportional, is added. Simulations show excellent proportionality, not only with data from actual elections, but also if that data is distributed differently, as we've shown before. The rural-urban system has excellent proportionality, as we just saw. It addresses the huge disparity in riding sizes and population densities that is a Canadian reality. It has fewer regional MPs than a normal mixed-member system, meaning that ridings remain smaller, or we could leave the existing ridings alone and simply enlarge Parliament to create those extra regional seats. That brings us to the end of our brief tour of proportional systems, and we can return to the values we discussed at the beginning. I think the proportionality of these systems make them inherently more fair than winner-take-all systems. In our current system, votes cast for less popular candidates are effectively discarded. In a proportional system, most votes contribute to the overall result. That encourages people to vote. Ranked ballots encourage civility and collaboration because candidates and their supporters know that they need to attract second and third preference votes in order to win. They can't trash those candidates and still expect to do well. Proportional systems and multi-member systems in particular make it easier for women and minorities to be elected, thereby diversifying Parliament. Lots of research indicates that a more diverse set of decision makers tends to lead to better decisions. Proportional systems are more complex, but perhaps we should instead say that winner-take-all systems are too simplistic for the modern world. All of these systems should protect the integrity of the system and ensure local and countable MPs. Proportional systems are more likely to give each person a like-minded representative. Finally, policies implemented by a proportional parliament, rather than a false majority, are more likely to represent the will of a broad cross-section of society and therefore more likely to be long-lasting rather than thrown out by the next party in power. I'd now like to shift to a more recent effort on my part. Fair Voting BC and Springtide, civil society organizations in British Columbia and Nova Scotia, respectively, have launched a court case. They aim to show that our current electoral system, first past the post, violates some of the guarantees made to Canadian citizens by the Constitution's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The claim is that first past the post is unconstitutional. There are two basic arguments. The first one stems from Section 3 of the Charter. Every citizen of Canada has the right to vote in the election of members of the House of Commons or of a legislative assembly and to be qualified for membership therein. Okay. Every citizen of Canada has the right to vote. But voting is not just the act of marking the ballot. Marking the ballot only has meaning if that ballot is also counted fairly. The other argument is based in Section 15 of the Charter. Every individual is equal before and under the law and has right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, and in particular without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. Okay. But winner-take-all systems, as we've seen, discriminate based on your viewpoint and location. For example, it discriminates against Liberal or Green voters in Alberta. It discriminates against Conservative voters in the Maritimes or Toronto. It discriminates against women, minorities, and other diverse groups, no matter where they are. This case is due to be heard in Ontario Superior Court in September of 2023, just a few months from when I'm recording this. The losing side is expected to appeal the matter, again in an Ontario court. The losing side in that case is expected to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, which may or may not decide to hear the case. That decision, of course, would be final. Traditional electoral analysis is focused to a large extent on whether the votes earned by a party is fairly translated into MPs belonging to that party. The analysis focuses on the parties. But the Canadian Constitution guarantees certain rights to citizens. It does not guarantee rights to parties. So we need an analysis that is focused on individual voters. We took inspiration from a 1991 Supreme Court decision on the effects of uneven riding sizes. They said, a system which dilutes one citizen's vote unduly as compared with another citizen's vote runs the risk of providing inadequate representation to the citizen whose vote is diluted. The legislative power of a citizen whose vote is diluted will be reduced, as may be access to and assistance from his or her representative. The result will be uneven and unfair representation. So, we set out to define a metric for the legislative power of the citizen. In an ideal world, every voter would have a legislative power share score of 1. All votes would be equally represented. This implies that the average LPS score would be also 1. Unfortunately, the world is not like that, as we've seen. We consider the legislative power score of voters who voted for a losing candidate to be 0. The winning candidate was not helped by those voters and is unlikely to share their perspective when voting in Parliament. Where did that legislative power go? It went to the voters who did vote for the winning candidate. But it's more complicated than that because it also depends on how many people voted for the candidate and the relative riding size. So here's our calculation. Let's start here. This is the total number of votes in the riding divided by the number of votes for the winner in that riding. If every voter voted for the same person, this value would be 1. Everyone would have the same legislative power, our ideal. But suppose that there are 100,000 votes in the riding, that value, and 50,000 of them voted for the winner, that value. Then this fraction becomes 2. Voters who backed the winning candidate have twice the legislative power as they deserve. The other half of the voters have no legislative power, and they get 0. Note that the average of everybody's legislative power share is still 1. It's conceivable that with multiple candidates, the winner might receive only 25 or 30% of the votes, resulting in a factor of 3 or even 4 for that candidate's supporters and 0 for everyone else. The other part of this equation accounts for differences in the number of voters in each riding. Ideally, each riding has the same population. In practice, they are allowed to vary by 10 or 15%, and even up to 25% with sufficient justification. So this value is simply the average riding size in the particular province. Dividing by the actual number of voters in that riding increases the legislative power for voters in smaller ridings and decreases the power for voters in the larger ridings. In a larger riding, for example, the attention of the MP is split between more people, hence the lower power. For example, if the average riding size has 100,000 voters and our riding has 80,000, then those voters have 100,000 over 80,000 or 1.5 times the legislative power as somebody in an average-sized riding. I calculated the legislative power share score for all of the individual voters for a given election and assigned each one to one of 9 buckets. About 50% were in the bucket labeled 0. They had a legislative power share score of 0. A little more than 20% of the population had scores of 2 or more, with others falling in between. Recall that the ideal is for everyone to have a power share score of 1. We'd like a very tall green bar right here in the middle. The middle bars are the good values, colored green. The bars at the edges are bad values, colored red. In between, the bars are colored yellow. In contrast, here are the values from a simulated single transferable vote election. Not perfect, but much better. We see that the red bars are much lower, the green bar is taller, there are lots of voters in the yellow range. but it is, on average, much better. When we look at the legislative power share for all of Canada's elections, the results are pretty consistently bad. It is slightly better in the early years, here, when we had only 2 effective parties. When we do similar calculations for countries who use proportional representation, we see that they do much better. In general, they have many fewer voters with a legislative power score of 0 and many more voters with a legislative power of approximately 1, shown by the green sections of those columns. Economists often use the Lorenz curve to describe income inequality for a country. Notice that we've changed here disciplines from electoral systems to income inequality. But we drew inspiration from this for our domain. Okay. In a Lorenz curve, the population of individuals is sorted by increasing income along the x-axis. So here are people with very small incomes, here are people with the largest incomes. And then on the y-axis, we say the share of income that they have. Okay? So here we start out with 0% of the population. The bottom 0% of the population has 0% of the income. All of the population has 100% of the income. In between, here, for example, the bottom 20% of wage earners have about 5% of the income. Meanwhile, the top 80% of the population have about 60% of the income, meaning that the richest 20% have 40% of the income. In a perfectly equitable income distribution, results in a straight line shown here for reference. We can do the same thing with the legislative power scores, resulting in this Lorenz curve. Here, voters are sorted by their legislative power score in increasing order. And again, this line would be perfectly equitable. Everybody has the same amount of power. Here's what we get in reality. The area between the 45-degree line and the lower curve is known as the Gini coefficient. It sums up the Lorenz curve in a single number where 0 is perfect equality and 1 is complete inequality. Here are some sample values for income and for legislative power. South Africa, with its legacy of apartheid and white rule, is probably the most unequal place on earth with respect to income. It has a Gini coefficient of 0.618. The United States has a large proportion of the world's billionaires and quite a few poor people, making it another country with a high level of inequality. Canada, Norway, Denmark all have more modest income inequalities. When we look at the Gini coefficient for legislative power scores, we see that Canada's score of 0.585 for the 2019 election makes it highly unequal. Countries using proportional representation have much lower Gini coefficients and thus much less inequality in legislative power. To summarize, elections are essentially run by algorithms. They use algorithms to turn their inputs or votes into outputs, winning candidates which then become MPs. There are many possible algorithms to use to run an election. One of my goals is to analyze these algorithms in terms of social goals, like fairly translating votes into MPs, encouraging people to vote, encouraging diversity in parliaments, and so on. We looked extensively at first past the post and noted it has many problems, particularly from a party-based perspective. We looked at 3 different families of algorithms, namely multi-member systems, mixed member systems, and a hybrid system, rural-urban proportional. They give much more proportional results and have and do much better on these social goals. Finally, we looked at a more voter-centered analysis that is one key point in the court case challenging the constitutionality of first past the post. It also shows benefits for proportional algorithms over winner-take-all algorithms. Thank you very much for listening to this. If you'd like more information, I'd recommend these websites: the Electoral Reform Committee from Parliament back in 2016, Fair Vote Canada, the Charter Challenge website, and my own work at electionmodeling.ca.